All right, welcome back to part two. Sorry for the abrupt ending of the video. The only thing you missed is Peter Jennings saying that the 60s ends in a tumultuous period, and it was foreshadowing what would take place in the 1970s. So, yeah, it was, I miscalculated on the video, and I didn't feel like re-recording the whole 15 minutes, so you missed about 10 seconds of the video. But we're going to continue now, and next up is Nixon's foreign policy is his madman theory. Now, Nixon is famous for coining the idea that he wanted the communists to know that he's a lunatic, or at least that's what he wanted to. And if you look on the second hash mark there, the idea is he wanted the Russians and the Red Chinese to really take a look at how crazy he was. And anything that they might do, it could not be predicted how Nixon was going to react. All right? Now, this is known as the madman theory. It's played out very, very well during this time. And Nixon is successful with it everywhere except Vietnam. In Vietnam, he tries to negotiate for peace, and he tries to use this madman theory to get them to negotiate, and the Vietnamese don't buy it. They don't bite at all. So Nixon is not successful in getting them to the bargaining table. Ultimately, he will, but right in the beginning part, he is not very successful. So he wants to have something known as peace with honor. And there's a lot going on here. All right, we need to spend a few minutes. In 1970, Nixon expands the war. Now, the Vietnamese were not stupid. The Americans put a set of rules or restrictions on their forces that says they cannot go certain places and they can't cross borders. And if you look at a map of Southeast Asia, Cambodia is bordering with Vietnam. And what the North Vietnamese would do is they would come down through North Vietnam along their western border with Laos and Cambodia, and then they would cross into Cambodia and go south through there, so they knew the United States could not attack them. And then they would set up their bases or their staging areas just across the border. And they would use them to go into South Vietnam and attack U.S. forces. Nixon expands the war. He orders troops to cross into Cambodia and attack the Vietnamese camps. This creates a major, major firestorm in the United States in terms of what's happening. Remember, the protests are big. Everybody's concerned about the war expanding at this point, and Nixon goes ahead and does it. And remember, he's elected with this idea of having peace with honor. He's going to bring the war to an end, okay? So this leads to massive riots and protests on American campuses, and perhaps the most famous one is at Kent State University in Ohio. As a result of the protests, the National Guard was called out to try to restore order. And in the process, they opened fire using live ammunition on American students, and 4 students are killed. And you have that very famous picture of the student sitting, kneeling down with the dead, with another student who was just shot. Let me show that to you. All right, so here's the picture. As I said, I would show it to you. This is the student that is shot by the National Guard. And this leads to, as I said, massive unrest across the nation. Campuses are shut down, students are sent home before final exams take place, and the country is in massive turmoil. And this is all in a reaction to Nixon widening the war into Cambodia, okay? A famous song is written at this time by Neil Young. It's called Ohio, and you may or may not have heard it in the past. And Neil Young was actually very frightened when he wrote and published and recorded the song, because Nixon was not known for being a nice person to people he didn't like, and he figured this would put him at the top of Neil Young figured this would put him at the top of Nixon's enemies list. And we're going to talk about Nixon's enemies list in a little bit. All right, so this is that famous image from Kent State. All right, so let's go back to what's going on. Le Duc Tho is the negotiator for North Vietnam. Kissinger is the American negotiator at this time, and they keep saying peace is almost at hand, but lots of things take place. South Vietnamese leadership obstructs things. North Vietnamese leadership doesn't do anything. And Nixon will use this for political gain. As I said to you guys when we were doing the images of Vietnam, he will drag his feet on this and use this as a leverage for the 1972 election. Okay? So he does win the election. He goes against George McGovern. McGovern is seen and portrayed as the hippie candidate and everything else. He wins the election in November. In December, he is busy dropping bombs on Hanoi and mining the harbor in Haiphong because he is trying to get them back. And the reality is he agrees to the same terms that the North Vietnamese offer as would have been offered early on before the election. So it's kind of frustrating when you look at it. The North promises to let people elect. The North does release the POWs, as you saw in the videos I showed you previously. And when you look at the list of deaths, more people are killed under Nixon than they are under Johnson. All right? So Nixon does give us the politically astute peace with honor and gets us out of Vietnam, but there is a heavy price to pay for that. All right, let's move on. Détente. This is important. All right. In addition to his madman theory, you got to understand Nixon. He's not stupid. He may be mentally insane, but he's not stupid. The term détente means a lessening of tensions. It really was designed by Nixon and Kissinger to play the Russians off against the Chinese. Now remember, we haven't had any relations with mainland China, as it was called, or also known as Red China at the time, since Mao's successful takeover in 1949, and since Harry Truman was accused of losing China and the communist menace and all that stuff. All right? So what's taking place is Kissinger goes on back and forth meetings with Chou En-lai, and he is doing this to set up a trip. Nixon is going to go to China. If there's any candidate, any American politician that can go to China and get away with it, it's Nixon. Why? Because he is such a well-known communist fighter. And it goes all the way back to his time on the House Un-American Activities Committee in the late 40s and the 1950s. Okay? So he does it. He goes to China. He meets with Mao Zedong, who is the leader of China at this point. And while he's busy doing this, Brezhnev, who is the leader of the Soviet Union, is wondering what's going on. And by going to meet with Mao and showing the world that the U.S. is ready to open up relations with China, Brezhnev starts thinking, and this is going to lead to the first major strategic arms limitation treaty known as SALT I. Okay? So eventually, Nixon is going to go to the Soviet Union. But let's take a look at a couple of minutes of video right now, which will give you an understanding of Nixon and his détente.
In one stunning swoop, the Cold War politics of the post-war era changed. America was recognizing and dealing with the communists.
Nixon was the great anti-communist, and to come on national television and announce that I've been invited to China and I've accepted with pleasure, it was astonishing. And you could tell by the reaction of the press.
White House aide Patrick Buchanan was on the trip the president called the week that changed the world.
We have at times in the past been enemies. We have great differences today.
He went to Beijing, frankly, because he was trying to work the foreign policy game to get the United States out of Vietnam with honor.
Nixon's aim was to have the Chinese pressure their North Vietnamese allies to come to terms at the peace table. And just 4 months after China, Richard Nixon became the first American president to visit Moscow, where he and Leonid Brezhnev signed the first Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty. The president got something else as well.
He wanted Mao and Zhou Enlai in Beijing to have sleepless nights wondering what's Nixon talking to Brezhnev about over there in Moscow tonight. And he was a genius at this. And putting those tensions on, which had the effect of blocking Soviet or Chinese getting together to present a united front against the United States in Vietnam.
Nixon had taken a calculated chance and it had worked. The Soviet Union cared more about getting controls on American offensive missiles and preventing the Americans from broadening and thickening an anti-ballistic missile system than they did about their little allies in North Vietnam, who were getting the living hell bombed out of them.
And there was a sense of being betrayed, soul dropped, at that time by the superpowers.
No longer able to depend on their powerful allies, the North Vietnamese appeared ready to make concessions at the peace talks. In October of 1972, there was an announcement from the National Security Advisor.
We believe that peace is at hand.
A month later, President Nixon, now seen as a seasoned world statesman, was re-elected in a landslide.
And of course, I assume you will remember the balloon images from the videos we watched previously. We were looking at the media. In October, he announces that it was it's peace is at hand, and in November he gets reelected, and in December we are bombing Hanoi and mining the harbors in Haiphong because the North Vietnamese had chosen to leave the table. So he plays this totally wonderfully, and it works for him. Let me show you the map from the 1972 election so you can see exactly how the nation appreciated Nixon. Okay, there it is. I know, it's kind of interesting. Washington, the District of Columbia, and the state of Massachusetts are the only two states to go for George McGovern. Nixon wins this 520 electoral votes to McGovern's 17. Nixon gets 46.7 million popular votes. McGovern only gets 28.9 or almost 29 million popular votes, okay? So Nixon does have a landslide victory here. He sees this, he's got a mandate, and he believes he's in a position where he can now begin to do other things he wants to do in his ideas, in his agenda for his second term. Okay, but we're not done yet. There's a lot going on. Remember the CIA, the good old Central Intelligence Agency? Remember all the, all the wonderful coups that they did in Guatemala and the attempts at the Bay of Pigs? Well, they continue into the 70s, okay? And Chile is just one example where you had the president Salvador Allende was elected by his people, but unfortunately he ran against the United States, or he ran afoul of the United States on the process of wanting to have more of a socialistic leftist style government. The CIA will overthrow him. Augusto Pinochet is put in power, and he is a ruthless dictator. He will be in power. There are death squads. There are all sorts of horrible things that will happen in Chile. People will disappear, never to be heard from again, all as an example of what the CIA is busy doing. And remember, it's all under the name of containment and fighting communism. The other thing that's happening, you have to go back and look at the Eisenhower Doctrine. The Yom Kippur War takes place in 1973, and Kissinger will go back and forth what they call shuttle diplomacy, and he will walk a tightrope. He will try to get the Israelis and the Arabs to come to terms, and they don't like each other. And so the Arabs decide they're going to punish the United States, and all of the Arabian countries that produce oil are part of their cartel known as OPEC, or the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, and they issue an oil embargo against the United States. They are going to reduce oil 5% every month until we settle the issue with Israel favorably to them. This creates the first oil crisis that we have in the United States in the 1970s. This is taking place in 73 and 74. And ask anybody who was around at that time that you know that was driving a car what it was like. I can tell you we used to sit in lines for gas waiting to fill up your cars, okay? And gas prices really went up at that time. I mean, they might have gone all the way to 50 cents a gallon, 40, 50 cents a gallon. And that was a lot of money back then. I know for you guys it's $4 a gallon. It seems crazy, but it was a lot of money. Okay, we're going to wind down this one, and we're going to pick up part 3 in just a moment.